Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time, and he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it had often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles. And he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain. So they begged him that he would permit them to enter them. And he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into a lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what had happened, they fled and told it to the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what had happened and came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. They also had seen it told by them what means he had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding regions of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. But the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you." And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 26 to 39. Welcome back, everybody, as we continue our trip through in our study of the Decapolis, the 10 cities of the southern Levant made famous in the New Testament. Let's do a quick little recap of last episode. In the last episode, we laid the basic lay of the land of Judea, and we talked about the history of the land of the southern Levant. We also got a quick rundown on Alexander the Great's meteoric rise, his fall, and then how his successors split up Alexander's conquests. We left off with the beginnings of the process of Greekifying the lands that were conquered by Alexander, what we call Hellenization. We saw that a lot of the conquered people were completely all in on Hellenization, but other peoples didn't like what was happening at all. Today, we're going to get into one particular group of people who rejected the idea of Hellenization, lock, stock, and barrel. In the last episode, we talked about the new law of the land that Antiochus Epiphanes laid down, that he put idols in Jewish sacred spaces, which was really bad. He imposed the Greek language, which a lot of people were seriously against. He sacrificed pigs and swine on the altar of the holiest of holies in the second temple of Jerusalem. Really bad. He also, with the help of some local Jewish leaders, started to build things like gymnasion, which was the Greek version of the Roman bath, which required people to go through them without any clothing, which again broke a lot of the Jewish customary rules. There was a particular group that lived out in the hinterlands where many rebellions often start in the hinterlands and not in the cities, especially these conservative traditionalist rebellions. Out there, a rural priest named Mattathias or Matisyahu had just about enough. He toppled the idol in his town and killed the local Seleucid official, and it was on. Mattathias and his 5 sons built up a resistance and waged a guerrilla-style war against the Seleucids. This whole war is a story in and of itself, but long story short, somehow, some way, this ragtag band of guerrillas won the war. They captured or conquered or retook, whatever you want to say, a really big swath of land from the Seleucids. The family of Mattathias took on a new name, the Maccabeans, which in Hebrew means the hammerers. They rededicated the second Jerusalem temple to God. It took 8 days, and seemingly there wouldn't be enough sacred oil to complete the job, but miraculously there was, and Hanukkah was born. Also, interestingly, Hanukkah remained a relatively minor holiday among rabbinical Jews up until fairly recently, and it didn't take off at all among Christians. All of this happened in and around 165 BCE. The story of how Maccabeans would become Hasmoneans is fascinating. We get much of this story from a few sources, from the books of Josephus and the books of Maccabees, which can be found in some versions of your Bible. That's a long story, and it has to do with the Septuagint, and that could be something we get into in future episodes. But the long story short, again, the Maccabeans were able to do this with a little help from their friends, the up-and-coming tough guys in the neighborhood, the Romans. And through all of this, the Maccabeans established their own strong kingdom. The kingdom of the Hasmoneans at its height was surprisingly big and continued to grow in a very competitive neighborhood. Now I'm going to give you a mental map. You should really look at a real map for this one because it is a bit confusing, but it's worth, at least if you're driving, to form a mental picture of what's going on here. But here we go. The Maccabean kingdom, which would turn into the Hasmonean kingdom in name, it was included about the northern 2/3 of the modern state of Israel, including the Palestinian territories. It also included, importantly for today, beyond the modern borders of Israel, the area to the east of the Jordan River Dead Sea complex. This is now maybe about the western, it's hard to say, maybe quarter, give or take, of the modern nation of Jordan, maybe a little smaller than a quarter. This Jewish state spread its borders to areas way outside of the historical kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The ideas of a group of very zealous Jewish believers became the guiding principles, at least early on, of this Second Temple Jewish kingdom. The beliefs of the groups called the Pharisees was built up. The whole idea of following the Mosaic law and the Torah law in a very specific way, and in many ways a rigorous way, was developing in a way that got time-stamped as ancient, but in many ways was very innovative. We will explore this idea for sure in future episodes. There's a lot of archaeology and textual evidence to support all of this. We're still dealing here with Second Temple Judaism, in which there were many different Jews who were following many different Judaisms. You had this kingdom of the Jews in the Middle East, but there were many Jews living all around the ancient world in diaspora who had different ideas on everything, culture and religion. Now, these Hasmoneans wouldn't be, as we saw, they weren't only limited to the geographic historical kingdoms of Israel and Judea. They spread into areas and conquered areas that were never Jewish in religion, culture, or ethnicity. Early leaders of this kingdom were super zealous conquerors and spreaders of Judaism to conquered people. There were even forced conversions and proselytization. Jews were not particularly known for forced conversions or proselytization, spreading the message, but they sure did do it at this time. This drive to gain new converts was retained in early Pharisaical, proto-rabbinical Judaism and Christianity, but would fade out in later developments of rabbinical Judaism. But it would stay in Christianity, especially the idea of proselytizing their religion. Later Hasmonean rulers were not so much into strict observance of the Jewish law, but that did continue within the religious authorities. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great podcasts like Mark Vinet's History of North America podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And now a quick word from our sponsors. The super strict, zealous Maccabeans fought against the Hellenization of the Judeans, but their successors turned around and in some ways were more Hellenized than the Jews who the Maccabean revolt were fighting against. So go figure that. But to get back to the point of the episode today, the Hasmoneans spread their power all over the Levant, specifically in an area important to our topic of this couple of episodes, the area east of the Jordan River, the land of the Decapolis, the land of 10 cities, but sometimes 14. We're getting close to getting into the Decapolis, but there's just one little bit more to talk about, that of Rome. The situation the Romans found them in was pretty complicated. The Romans and the Seleucids fought a big war right before the Maccabean revolt. The Seleucids took a big hit from this war. They had to pay Rome a huge indemnity to pay back for this war, and they lost parts of Anatolia. The Seleucids suffered defeats from the Romans, some defeats from the Ptolemies, and defeats by the Parthians. All of these things weakened the Seleucids. The Seleucids were pretty much living on life support after this loss to the Romans, and they're playing pickle in the middle. They're getting hit by the Romans to the west. They're getting hit by the Parthian resurgent empire and groups to the east. The Ptolemies are making a bit of a comeback from the south as well. The Hasmoneans, like Alexander in a lot of ways, had a meteoric rise but crashed pretty fast. They always had a ton of infighting and civil wars because they never solved really the problems that were happening inside of their empire or their kingdom between the really zealous Jews of different sects. So they had tons of religious sectarianism. And then when they conquered new lands, they also brought in groups that didn't particularly want to adapt to their culture. Increasingly, the Romans had enough with the Seleucids. By 63 BC, Pompey the Great, who would be in a triumvirate with Julius Caesar and then ultimately have a falling out with Caesar, but this same general, Pompey the Great, took some of the areas of the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans directly into Roman occupation. Out of all that, he made an area into a Roman province called Syria. He also set aside some lands around the area for client kingdoms run by the Hasmoneans. Finally, Pompey Magnus peeled off a section east of the Jordan River and made the Decapolis, which was a league of semi-independent city-states, which was a really common thing in Greek politics. These cities in a league were designed to both work together and compete. The cities had some independence, and I mean, mostly independent, but were ultimately under Roman control. There would be a core of cities in this league, but other cities would sometimes be included in differing lists and at differing times. So this is the core cities of the Decapolis, and we'll get into some detail into these cities. There was Philadelphia, which is the modern country of Jordan's capital city, now called Amman. There was Gerasa, Gadara, Pella, Dion, Raphana, Scythopolis, which was the only city to the other side of the Jordan River, Hippos, Kanatha, and Damascus, which is now the capital city of the modern country of Syria. What was the culture of the Decapolis? And in other words, what was the vibe of the Decapolis? These cities were largely pagan, with populations of Greeks, Syrians, and Arabs and other peoples. There were some Judeans and Jews, but that Jewishness wasn't the character of these cities. This general area of the Decapolis was not happy under Hasmonean rule, where Jewish religion and culture were being pushed upon them. When Pompey came to town, they were more than happy to be done with the Hasmoneans. This was a major win-win for the Romans. The Decapolis cities got to control the lucrative trade routes that ran through their territory, and they got semi-independence from Rome. The Romans got a cut of the action from these trade routes, so everybody was getting rich. One of the major differences between the Decapolis cities and other Judean towns nearby was a significant difference in diet. Archaeological evidence shows that difference. Take Gadara, where the exorcism of the Gerasene or Gadarene demoniac from the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke occurred. That was the quote from the beginning of the last episode. This story from the Gospels brings up a lot of questions. So right off the bat, what was a herd of pigs doing in a Jewish area? Well, we see this area was ruled for a time by the Hasmoneans, and it had some Jewish character, but in large part, it wasn't Jewish, even though geographically it was very close to Jesus's homeland. Then you ask the question, why would Jesus go to this area that was outside of the traditional Jewish kingdom and Jewish cultural milieu in the first place? His headquarters was in and around the northern part of the Sea of Galilee in the city of Capernaum, but the Decapolis was pretty much right in view of where Jesus was making his first teaching missions. Now, here's some speculations. The Galileans were fairly new to Judaism. It is possible that they saw spreading their message to the non-Jew pagans across the river frontier as a good thing, as many new converts do. Jesus and his disciples may not have viewed the people of the Decapolis necessarily as the other, but as some people who needed some help, especially the demon-possessed guy who may have been famously possessed, whereas people even on the other side of the Jordan River heard of him. Just to put into perspective how close Gadaras was to Capernaum, you can't walk or drive straight from Gadaras, which is called Kais, Jordan, to Capernaum, Israel today. There's a demilitarized zone in the middle, so you have to drive way to the south to go through a border checkpoint and then go to the north. But if you were living back in the 1st century CE, AD, you could take a boat trip from the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee to the southern tip. The Gospels say it took overnight, but they hit a storm along the way. On a good day, it might have only taken a few hours, a short few hours to get from north to south. And with no DMZ in the middle, it was about a 6-mile walk, 10-kilometer walk from the Sea of Galilee, where you could land your boat, to Gadaras. And it was uphill, so maybe a few hour walk. I mean, if you're really walking hard at 6 miles, you can do that in 2 or 3 hours. Some people can run that in like a half an hour or an hour, not this guy, but you can run that. People can run that pretty quickly or walk that pretty quickly. Overall, it might have only taken maybe 12 hours or so in bad conditions to get to Gadaras, exorcise a legion of demons into a herd of pigs, and then get back to Capernaum. You leave early in the morning, you could be home for a late dinner, or you leave late that evening, get caught in a storm. You're still in Gadaras by the morning, and you could very easily have been home for lunch. Now with the pigs, let's get into the pigs. That's a really big question. Why cast these demons into pigs? The people of the Decapolis had a lot less problem with pigs than the neighboring Judeans did. The Arab populations probably didn't love pigs and pork products, but the Greek population was huge fans of pigs. And we have data. Particularly, I'm using data from a book called The Origins of Judaism, which is by a Israeli archaeologist named Yonatan Adler. The archaeological evidence from faunal assemblages, which is a group of animal bones found together in a certain layer, 70% of the bones found in Kais, which is modern day Gadara, were pig bones. The Gadarenes loved them some pork. As a comparison, the city of Qumran, or the township of Qumran, whatever you want to call it, where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, 0% of the bones found in their faunal assemblages were of pigs. And from faunal assemblages found in various parts of Jerusalem, again, most of Jerusalem, 0. There's some parts where there's up to 30%, but those were likely where Greeks and Romans were living. Oddly, though, Pella, a Decapolis city, had a relatively small 5% pork bones in their faunal assemblages, but that could be for a variety of reasons, which we will dig into as we progress through this story. Oh, can I get your attention for just a second? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits for supporting the show on Patreon. The most important, though, is being included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops commemorated in their order of precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Pigs are really strange creatures with a strange history. I mean, if we're to back up even just a little bit, pigs are one of those animals that's just very, very lightly domesticated, meaning that pigs can live in a domesticated way, and they take on the attributes of domesticated animals. They lose their hair turns different colors. They lose certain sexual traits, such as tusks in the males, and they in general, both male and female domesticated animals keep certain immature aspects, like they don't grow into fully adult versions like their wild brethren do. Some animals are super domesticated, like dogs. When they go feral, they almost want to go back to be with people. Like they never go fully wild. That's it. And same thing happens with cows as well. Like a lot of these animals, when they go, if a domesticated version of that animal goes and gets out of the domus, meaning out of human control, they often can't even survive, or they won't mate. There's a lot of things where certain domesticated animals like cats will just go completely feral very quickly, and pigs are that way, and even more so. But that's the short story of the domestication of pigs. But keep that in the back of your mind as we discuss the history of pigs in the domus, in the domesticated world. Again, I always there's two things I'm going to give a shout out to in this discussion of pigs. One is the book Against the Grain by James C. Scott. I am also going to give a big shout out to the primary source for this is the Religion for Breakfast channel on YouTube. He has a much more detailed episode on the history of pigs in the Middle East. And his short story, John Henry, he's the host of the channel, and I've gotten some information from other sources, but the short story of pigs they're really useful animals to have in the domus. They are more or less trash recyclers or walking composters. They are born, eat human scraps, and then can be eaten themselves all about in a year, from piglet to table, about a year. Pig mamas are birthing machines. They can have a whole lot of pig babies each year. Huge litters they can have, from as little to 3 and up to even more. I live in hog country, one of these areas of the United States that has a really big problem with feral pigs, domesticated pigs. They were pigs that were domesticated that escape, which happens all the time. They're having a problem with them in Britain. It's a huge problem in the southeastern United States, all the way from up in the northern part of the upper South, all the way into Texas. Huge problem in Texas. I can discuss this more if you want, but I'll be in certain places, and even in the suburbia where I live, sometimes you might see a troop of hogs just run by the interstate, one of the busiest interstates in the whole United States, and one of the most densely populated areas of the state. And there'll just be a whole bunch of wild hogs running around. Now to get back to let's keep getting back into the domus, the domesticated area. The trash compactor role of pigs is great because pigs don't need a ton of husbandry. They just walk around and eat. And believe it or not, they're pretty clean animals in actuality. So these qualities in pigs that they don't need a lot of husbandry. The pigs can have a lot of babies, and they can be culled really quickly, makes them a very democratic animal, meaning the urban poor and even urban or rural tenant farmers can keep pigs and have a sustainable supply of protein. The aristocracy did not love that aspect of pig raising. It's hard to tax an animal that has such a quick turnaround and is semi feral. Also, overall, A pig is really only useful for its meat. It isn't a beast of burden anyway. It doesn't protect the domus. It doesn't produce really any non-meat products uh, or products over time that don't require killing, such as milk or wool. You don't get anything out of that. Even the skin really isn't suited to, say, turning into leather. It's much more used for food product as well, such as pork cracklings or chicharrones or whatever you call them in your neck of the woods. That made it so that pigs weren't a store of value for the wealthy classes. The wealthy classes made money by having things that were a store of value, grain that could be stored or turned into beer, grapes that could be turned into wine, wool that could be traded, leathers and skins that could be traded, milk, all of that stuff that either sedentary agriculturalists wanted, nomadic to semi-nomadic pastoralists, or even sedentary pastoralists pigs could be a side business or a side thing to just fulfill your local needs, but they couldn't be traded. Pigs just weren't a high value, high status trade item. The economic aspects of pig rearing may have been one of the reasons why they started to go out of fashion in these highly hierarchical agrarian cultures that established themselves in the Fertile Crescent. That's the commercial story of pigs. What is the religious take on the humble swine in the area of the Levant or Western Fertile Crescent? Even into the Easter, the whole Fertile Crescent in general. Pigs originally were not verboten in the ancient Fertile Crescent. There are records of lard being given to Babylonian temples as an offering. Pigs had something of a religious value that was positive because of their nature as trash collectors. The pigs ate up the garbage, but gave you a wholesome, edible product at the end of the line. Pigs, so that kind of turned into pigs could take sin and through their sacrifice get rid of the sin. This ritualistic use of pigs began to go out of fashion, though, because you can see it go both ways. This absorber of garbage, but turning it into something edible and useful, you could see how that could be seen as a positive, but you could also see like, hey, wait a minute, these things are eating garbage in, garbage out. It could go both ways. The garbage eating value eventually became to be seen as something that made them impure, both ritualistically and as a foodstuff. But that is exactly what Jesus did with the legion of demons and the guy at Gadara. He made a substitution sacrifice of the herd of pigs. The demons went into the pigs, then they ran off a cliff and died. That raises a huge question. Were some people in the areas outside of Judea still valuing pigs both economically and ritualistically? The Greeks did. Were the Arabs still doing it? Were some Jewish people still doing it? Were some Jewish sects like absolutely positively no on the pigs? Were some Jews at least agnostic about the pig? Did some of this extreme taboo against pigs not seep into all Jewish areas on the periphery of the Maccabean rigorist heartland? Did Jews outside of the classical Judean area not have that much of an aversion to pigs as their Judean heartland rigorist brethren? Could Jesus have been also maybe trying to make a connection to the Greeks and the pagans of the Decapolis with this act of driving the demons into the swine, like basically taking a ritualistically unpure thing, pigs, and putting in demons into that is like a double whammy? On the other hand, though, the Greeks and the Romans, they didn't have a problem with either pork or idols. Pigs were a huge part of the diet of the Romans, and so were other foodstuffs that the Jews wouldn't literally find kosher. The Synoptic Gospels all say something along the lines of 2 points. Once all that is said and done with the casting out of those demons, they all say something to the effect of the people of the towns were freaking out after what they saw, what Jesus did, and they asked Jesus to leave. But secondly, the demon-possessed guy, who's no longer demon-possessed, asked Jesus if he can join up with Jesus. And Jesus told him essentially, your heart's in the right place, but stay here in the Decapolis and spread the word of what happened. What Jesus did was made a disciple or an apostle of a pagan in the land of the Decapolis. That's a big part of the push and the pull between early followers of Christ, some who thought the religion was for the ethnos of the Jews, and those who thought that Jesus's message was more universal. And what we can see is that there was a rigorous Judean tradition that was connected into the heartland around Jerusalem within this burgeoning Christian movement. But there were also people in Jesus's ranks who did not hold to these positions. So there was both of them inside of the early Christian ranks. There was also these diaspora Jews outside of the Judean heartland who held some overlapping views as Judeans, but also diverging views as well. You have the pagans outside of the Jewish religion who were starting to see something they liked with this religiosity of the Jews, but couldn't go all in on the rigorous nature of the Judeans. There was an alternative, though, the more Hellenized Judaism that was floating around, that was not quite as rigorous as what was going on in the Judean heartland. And we see this push and pull and hearkening back to what you might call that good old-fashioned religion of the Judeans in the heartland versus the more liberalizing, at least more liberalizing aspect of the diaspora Hellenized Jews, or at least this idea in the mind. It's always an idea of the mind of the heartland of the traditionalist versus the folks who have spread out, who aren't holding the line. But we see that that's not always the case. If we look at cultures around the world of groups that have left the heartland that stay more traditional, that's a whole nother story that we will definitely get into, though. As a final thing to leave ourselves with, when people say that Christianity has just warmed up Greco-Roman paganism, they really miss the point, and in a large point, they're wrong. Christianity is an offshoot of Second Temple Judaism. It is not just a version of Greco-Roman paganism, or maybe Greco-Roman paganism cults with Jesus instead of ISIS or whatever. That's just not the case. You look at the evidence. It's not the case. And I'd love to hear your arguments pro and against that topic. That's a line in the sand that I'm willing to plant my flag in. In my opinion, Christianity of what it became, what we could really say Pauline Christianity, is when a particular strand of Second Temple Judaism met with the process of Hellenization. We can see how Hellenization was both embraced and rejected in this area of the Levant. Hellenization made the Decapolis. The Decapolis was a Hellenized land in the heart of a Semitic land. And This area of the world changed the cultures and the ideas of really the entire planet because of the blending of these two ideas of Second Temple Judaism and the idea of Hellenization. In the next few episodes, we are going to dive into some more detail of the cities of the Decapolis. We'll look into their history, both before and after the Greeks came and went, and how Hellenization affected them. Thanks for joining me on this trip through the history of the Decapolis and of the early church, and I will talk to you soon. Before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, who are all magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.